Hey everyone, so I know we're excited to talk about exotic weapons now that I'm done talking about legendary weapons, but before we get started, I wanted to say a few things that will help contextualize why I put certain weapons in certain tiers this season. So to start things off, I want to reiterate, this is an endgame focused tier list. Last season, I probably let a couple weapons slide that probably shouldn't have been in the upper tiers because people said, you know, it's surprisingly decent, maybe it's decent in low level content, but this time I want to take it a lot more seriously, so I focused on feedback from specifically endgame players. As a result, any weapon that an endgame player would not consider seriously for a serious endgame loadout, for a serious endgame activity, is going to be in the F tier. As a result, the vast majority of D2 exotic weapons are actually in the F or E tier. One more thing, I also want to say that this is not like a traditional YouTuber tier list. If you see a weapon in C or D tier, that doesn't mean it's bad. The letters don't necessarily represent the traditional tier list structure. I would say anything from like S to D tier is maybe considerably decent, right? Just because the size of the F and the E tier are so wide. So I made the tiers a lot more precise this time, but as a result, they've shrunk in size. So, you know, don't be offended if a weapon that you think is good or decent is in the C or D tier. This is not like a traditional YouTuber's tier list where like the C and D tier are like the garbage or not very good stuff. They're just decent, but probably not the most frequent stuff that you might take into endgame content if you were trying to be optimal. So that's number one. Number two, the way we structure the exotic weapon tier list, if you guys haven't watched the previous video, is I do it based on use rate by optimal players. So we have 6 different possible endgame scenarios here that I'd like to go over. We have solo. Solo is stuff like solo dungeons, solo master lost sectors, maybe even solo GM, solo raid challenges, just solo content. You're by yourself, you have to make your own ammo, so maybe exotic primaries are, more of a bonus. You have to survive, there's a big consistency focus here, so that's solo content. GMs, I'm thinking more fire team GMs, right? And I'm thinking more optimal fire team GMs. So stuff like galley is going to be prioritized here, stuff where, just shredding through a bunch of ads, champion focused, very underlight content is going to be the focus of this column. Next, we have DPS. I'm thinking raid and dungeon DPS. If you're in a fire team of 6 or 3 and you're doing DPS, what's the most optimal pick? That's going to be the DPS column. We have day ones. So day ones are ultra consistency focused. How can I stay alive while still clearing ads? Similar to solo in some ways, except not as ammo generation focused and more team play focused, I would say. More consistency focused, even to a greater degree. Low mans and speeds are a little unique. Now, the 4 of these columns are a little non-specific, and what I mean by that is they're kind of broad strokes, right? Low mans and speeds, there are specific low man encounters or challenges. There are specific speedrun strategies that call for specific weapons. And so as a result, these are going to be maybe a little bit more precise, whereas these 4 are kind of just the idea. It's a concept, right? In maybe solo content, you're thinking of conceptually, what would give me the most survivability theoretically in some solo content, right? Whereas speedrunning, you could be like, in the King's Fall Golgoroth encounter, I want to use this specific exotic weapon, right? So it's kind of a little different territory, but I think both of them are valuable aspects to look at when we talk about endgame content. So as for this key here, there are 4 possible classifications that I've put these weapons into. We have a checkmark, which is optimal. This will work, rain or shine, all the time. This is a great pick, top of the meta. We have uncommon, which is, this is still a good pick, but you won't take it all the time, right? You won't take it all the time. It's not unconditionally good. Situational is, there's probably a better exotic weapon you could use instead here, but this could be good in some very niche situations. And wasted is, don't get it twisted, right? Wasted doesn't mean it's literally worse than a legendary counterpart. There are some, obviously, that are worse than a legendary counterpart. But wasted just means it's just not worth using. It's just not worth using. There are other exotic weapons that are certainly more worth your time, no matter what. So that's the key. That's the system. Let's go ahead and look at the changelog and talk about the different exotic weapons that I moved from the previous season. So before we get started, let me get this out of the way. Remember how I said I'm going to be way harsher on exotic weapons this season? This is what I meant. So increased tier strictness, a ton of exotics got pushed down into the F tier or into the E tier or into lower tiers as a result of me just tightening the tiers and making sure they really represent what an endgame player's interests are located at. Okay, so let's start with all the detailed stuff now. Ergo Sum, this is a new exotic sword that we got this season in the special slot. I've made plenty of videos on this thing, or very exhaustive videos on this thing, and the 2 main reasons why it's in the A tier are its best-in-class non-surrounded sword damage, and it has strong neutral play with Arc Conductor, right? So both really good stuff. You have, Caster Polaris, Vortex Telesto, Lightweight Telesto, you have, Wave Arc Conductor, you have Pack Hunter Provision. This is excellent for all of those things, right? So are single-handedly used in like 3 different things that are all pretty optimal in endgame content, so that's why it's in the A tier. We have Arbalest. Arbalest and Wishender are kind of a package duo. I've moved both of them into the D and E tier respectively, because these days, intrinsic barrier is not necessarily a selling point on exotics anymore. Radiant is so common, whether it's from the seasonal artifact, whether it's from stuff like Facet of Dawn, or, you know, Ember of Torches. There's just so much Radiant in this game that you can get, and of course, anti-barrier primaries, taking them is not really a huge downside anymore, right? I don't think anyone's complaining about, like, anti-barrier Outbreak, for example. So, yeah, I would say, you know, Arbalest and Wishender are at an all-time low in terms of relevance for barrier stunning, and in terms of other stuff, I've seen some people say that, you know, oh, Arbalest is good because it one-shots any shield. This is almost never relevant in D2 endgame content. Maybe in Ghost of the Deep, but that's really the one place I can see it being useful, and that's why Arbalest is actually in the D tier instead of the E tier, because it's used in some places like Ghost of the Deep to one-shot shields, whereas Wishender really isn't used in the same way, right? So that's it for Arbalest and Wishender. Let's talk about Deterministic Chaos next. So for reference, Deterministic Chaos I think does around 2 times the DPS of Divinity, and so up until recently there isn't really many bosses where you can't tractor them. You still want to debuff them, but you don't really need a crit spot. And the Witness kind of changed that, right? So Deterministic Chaos, you know, you could argue it's maybe useful if you don't have Transcendence and, like, you know, Snare Bombs on your team, or like Freezing Singularities on your team. Like, if you don't have Transcendence access and you're not constantly weakening the target using abilities, you know, Deterministic Chaos can be used, like I said, as a higher DPS Divinity for targets where you don't need to make a crit. And so even though that's super niche, super situational, I think that does deserve putting it over F tier, because it is possibly, maybe, going to be used by an endgame player for that at some point. Lament, I mean, not to give you the sob story, but, you know, this is kind of how it is now. Lament can't get Pack Hunter, has worse healing now, has a cut to its damage, it's worse than Heart Shadow for DPS, and it's just there's no reason to take Lament in 2024, and the same criticisms for Barrier Intrinsic that I talked about on Arbalest and Wishender also apply to Lament. There's, like, really, I don't see people speedrunning GMs with Lament anymore, so yeah, really, there's just no reason to use Lament anymore, so it's going to stay in the F tier now. Revision 0. I think I underrated Revision 0 last time around. Obviously, its damage to miners, its damage to red bars is incredibly high. One of the highest, if not the highest, I think, neutral red bar damage that you can get on an exotic primary. And it's just, you know, it's pretty solid for that. The only criticism I can lay against this thing is that it doesn't have splash damage access, which is kind of a big deal for exotic primaries. Most of the time when you're taking an exotic primary, it's either for utility purposes or it's to deal a lot of splash damage, right? We're thinking stuff like Khvostov or Sunshot or Graviton, right? Those are going to be the strong exotic primaries on this list that people tend to value. Revision 0 really just doesn't have any splash damage, and it does take a decent amount of time to wind up its sniper shots, and even when you do get those sniper shots, you know, you can like 2-shot, 3-shot a champ from what I've been told, and that's not super appealing in a sandbox where, like, you know, Consecration can like 1-shot champs with the right buffs. So I don't know, it's not incredibly useful, I would say, for an optimal player, but certainly for a slower playstyle, I can see the value in this weapon, and so that's why I've decided to put it in the E tier. Next up, we have our next newest exotic weapon, and that's going to be Red Death Reformed. Red Death Reformed struggles from the same problems that Revision 0 does, except it provides a lot more survivability, right? So maybe in stuff like a day 1, if you're a slower playstyle player, not as aggressive, you're just hanging out, focusing on staying alive, Red Death Reformed is like the buried bloodline of pulse rifles, right? It's like, it gives you access to cure ×2 every time you get a kill, you can heal clip your allies, it straight up makes like a Touch of Flame healing grenade on the floor, which is, you know, obviously incredibly strong. So, you know, the lack of splash damage is very noticeable on this weapon, but besides that, it's obviously very strong survivability wise, so I decided to put it in the D tier in case there is a situation where you can't really afford to be super aggressive, splash isn't a huge focus, but you just really want to stay alive with constant healing. So that's RDR. Next, we have Necrochasm. Necrochasm, I think I overrated last season. Being the auto rifle that it is with like an unstable recoil pattern, it is relatively difficult, I would say, at longer ranges where an auto rifle plays to get crit kills consistently with this weapon. And even when you do, the explosion, it's nice, but it doesn't really scale super well into endgame content. Now, Necrochasm, part of this is obviously we have Khvostov now, right? And I'd like to briefly discuss the paradigm of on-hit versus on-kill exotics, right? Or just in general, in D2. In endgame content, as the enemies get tankier, healthier, you want to prioritize weapons that can get kills and get splash effects without actually needing to kill enemies. Because let's say you're in an encounter with a bunch of red bar knights at a GM level, if you use a weapon like Necrochasm, it's going to be pretty hard to get a kill on just one of them, right? Whereas if you use a weapon like Khvostov, which has a bouncing bullet every 7 hits, well, you know, you don't really need to get kills, right? You just need to hit the enemies, and you get that splash effect. So as a result, you know, Necro it doesn't scale well into endgame content for that reason. You need to get those kills to ramp it up. But that being said, it's not horrible or anything. Its ad clear potential is actually pretty decent if you get kills. And so I decided to put it in the E tier. It's certainly not deserving of F tier, but I wouldn't say it's like a first choice exotic primary by any stretch. Now, on the other end, we have Monarque. Monarque has been, yeah, the note kind of describes it pretty well. It's been eclipsed by other high lethality primaries. People used to take these into solo GMs for like overload stun, and you would get like that poison tick damage, and it would be pretty useful. You could like stick a shield with it, and it would tick down on enemies slowly. But that time has kind of come and gone. I think abilities are very strong right now. We have other strong exotic primaries that are more solo focused, and I don't think there's any reason why an endgame player would take Monarque in 2024. Ager Scepter is up next. A lot of the exotic traces got sent straight down to the F tier this season, and that's because exotic specials have really taken a hit. Really, when you're taking an exotic primary, you're generally trying to focus on either like utility, very high splash actor with infinite ammo, or finder generation, right? And Ager Scepter, it doesn't do any of the first two purposes better than an exotic primary like Khvostov or Sunshot or Graviton, but at the cost of not generating enough ammo because it's a special weapon. So if you're going to take an exotic special in today's content as an endgame player, you need to have a damn good reason for it. And Ager Scepter, will given form, is kind of a waste these days with how valuable prismatic supers are. The splash damage is nice, but it's not really, you know, anything to write home about in my opinion, given the current sandbox. So yeah, Ager Scepter, primary buffs, exotic specials are pretty weak. All right, next we have Euphony and Microcosm. Euphony, I originally had it in a pretty low tier, but I moved it up a little bit. I think Euphony's main use in 2024, maybe surprising, is not for main DPS, like a lot of people have been touting it continuously, even after my video. But Euphony, I think, is good for total damage special ammo extension. So in a day one, let's say you're completely out of heavy, you're doing a final stand or something like that, Euphony is a great option in that case. It does fairly good TPS, and it has excellent total damage, like excellent total damage for a special weapon, right? So like I said before in my previous videos, if you're, you know, out of heavy ammo and you have kinetic special ammo, then swap your exotic to Euphony and go dump with that thing. Maybe you're out of Microcosm ammo during a day one and you're out of final stand, swap to Euphony and you'll do considerable damage. So that's why I like Euphony for that specific purpose. That's why it's in the C tier. Microcosm, same thing. Microcosm is also very strong in day one consistency focused damage options. It's just very consistent. You pop your super, you hold down left click, you can hit your teammates, you won't blow up. You can accidentally hit body shots and you won't get penalized that much compared to like stuff like linears, which were traditionally taken in day ones. The precision requirement is very minimal on this thing, and it's the most like brain dead damage option ever. It's so easy to use, right? So I had to kind of give it the C tier for that. And Microcosm is a good example of a weapon that's really good in like one specific aspect of content, but is punished because it's not like optimal in other areas of content. And you'll see that when we get to the actual tier list, and we'll go over like the tier structure and stuff like that. Okay. Moving on, we have Izanagi's Burden. Izanagi's Burden was hit relatively hard by the kinetic special nerf, one of the biggest kind of losers, I suppose, of the Final Shape patch. However, I would say the main reason why Izanagi's Burden has moved down from A to B tier is because Still Hunt kind of does the same job as Izanagi's Burden, even though it's in a different slot. And there's other pretty strong special exotics for DPS now. Izzy is really just really limited to, like, I would say 2 use cases. Number one is killing precision targets from a long distance away very quickly. So stuff like Tormentors and third encounter of Salvation's Edge. Or it's kind of for assisting for DPS, but only in really specific rotations and on specific bosses. So before, where Izanagi's, you know, used to be the thing that everyone used for everything, I would say nowadays it's only used on specific classes, specific rotations, on specific bosses. And so I had to kind of tank it down to the B tier, even though it is still a pretty decent exotic, and nothing has really replaced it in the kinetic slot. So that's why it's in the B tier. Okay, Monte Carlo. This is an example of an exotic that I mentioned earlier, where I kind of listened to people who were like, oh, this thing is so good for my melee build, and then I went out and tried it. And Monte Carlo scales horribly in endgame content. Number one, as an auto rifle with no splash or no really crazy high damage buff, this thing's damage profile is horrible in endgame content. Its kill pressure is just extremely lackluster. And for the effects that it provides to you, with the current sandbox, all the melee builds are basically prismatic, and if you're on prismatic, you have access to a Hoyle class item, so you could just spend your time actually just killing ads instead of, you know, trying to scrape together kills with Monte Carlo and Markov chain and just trying to like randomly get your melee back. Instead, you could just be spamming the melee and killing all the ads. So Monte Carlo, I think, you know, it's in theory like a decent weapon, but its role in endgame content is basically non-existent. And so it doesn't have the crazy kill pressure that something like a Sunshot or a Graviton or even a Khvostov has, and it doesn't really have the utility that is super, super useful in the way that maybe a Lumina has, or like, you know, another weapon with high utility might have. So Monte Carlo in the F tier, I think it kind of makes sense, unfortunately. Witherhoard just drops a tier because Lost Signal does basically the same thing, and I think Witherhoard usage is going down even further compared to last season, which is kind of a shame, but you know, Witherhoard, it is what it is. It's useful for, I don't know, maybe some damage rotations, maybe like on a day one, if you want to extend your total damage, you're the only person on your team using it. Maybe you have like a Malfeasance strategy going on, potentially useful, but for now, I mean, Witherhoard, I really don't think it's that great, right? It's kind of had its time, and the pool nerf really hit it hard, and Lost Signal literally has a longer pool duration than Witherhoard now if you hold down the trigger. So, you know, kind of a shame, but that is what it is. Quicksilver Storm. Okay, so Quicksilver Storm, first of all, I think I overrated it last season. I think B tier was a little high for it. But on top of that, it's had a massive scaling and uptime nerf on its grenades. And so apparently I've been told that you need to hit an entire mag on a single target just to get your grenades now, which is really horrible. This thing is basically just like an auto rifle with nanotech tracer rockets now, except you get like an okay grenade payoff every single mag, which is like kind of pathetic, to be honest. So I don't think there's any reason why you would take this thing over like a Khvostov. So yeah, F tier. I don't think there's any reason why an endgame player should use QSS, if there even was a reason to use one back in the day before the final shape patch. Okay, next up we have Edge of Action. Edge of Action and Lumina are both kind of similar. No Hesitation does a similar job without taking up the exotic slot. Now, Lumina does have some use still, right? In low man content, it is still an excellent way of giving a buff to your teammates if you don't have a Well or Radiant or Emperor or whatever. It's a really good way to give a 35% buff for 10 seconds to you, one of your teammates, and maybe if you're doing a trio, like a third teammate, right? So, or a third fire team member. So Lumina is still, I would say, more efficient than Edge of Action, I would say, in like low man scenarios. It's also used for Lumina grappling and speedrunning, but I think No Hesitation did kind of, you know, take its job a little bit, so I moved it down to the B tier. I've also made the tiers a little bit more restricted, which is why I moved it down to the B tier. I think Edge of Action took the bigger hit, and that's because Edge of Action is really only used in really optimal endgame speedrunning or low mans, like challenges, and even in that content, you know, it's kind of hard to justify its reason because Titan isn't really used for that purpose anymore, I would say. The only reason actually why Titan was used in King's Fall speedrunning was because of Daughter's desync, right? Where you could use Hammer of Soul and dunk on both Daughters to take both their brands. However, that's been patched, so there's not really a reason to have a Titan in King's Fall anymore. So this thing's use rate in speedrunning has gone from like being used in 2 King's Fall encounters to being used in 0. So yeah, I kind of had to drop it a lot of tiers. I mean, it's still kind of useful, right? It's got some defensive utility. It obviously still gives you that 5% bonus, but No Hesitation gives you a 10% bonus, isn't exotic, and is probably easier to scale up on hit. So yeah, that's all I have to say for these two. Let's move on. Anarchy, I mean, I easily could have just said increased tier strictness for Anarchy, but yeah, it's only used in speedrunning. It's only used to trapdoors. That's all you need to know. Leviathan's Breath. Leviathan's Breath used to be a pretty decent damage option overall. However, there are other higher total damage heavy options now. Notably stuff like 1k, stuff like Microcosm, right? That are all just as easy to use, but only suffer in DPS by a tiny bit compared to this thing. So I really think this thing is not that great. Even for solo damage, I would say it loses out to stuff like Microcosm. And I would say for GMs, it's kind of been eclipsed too. I don't really think Leviathan's Breath is really worth your exotic slot in a GM these days. So that's why I've decided to drop it 2 tiers. Okay, Eyes of Tomorrow. See, I was an Eyes of Tomorrow stan. I saw the buff that they gave to it where, you know, you get a ammo refund every 4 kills. And then I actually tried using Eyes of Tomorrow in like Crota's End speedruns and stuff like that. And it was really lackluster to say the least, right? Even in encounters where you have a relatively high number of adds, think stuff like Crota's End Abyss, right? It's just the kill pressure is so low, right? It's really cool to use this weapon. I won't lie, right? It feels really cool to like ADS on ads, see all the red squares and ting 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 and like track, but number one, it takes a long time to do that, right? And compared to just Galley, where you just like look at them and shoot, right? Number two, the rockets take forever to arrive at their target. So by the time they arrive there, the targets could have moved behind cover. Even if you shoot straight up into the sky and allow the rockets like vertically track upward and back down, it's still not very consistent, I would say. Unless the ad density of an encounter is absolutely insane. And even then, there's like other weapons that do the same job have the same level of lethality, but don't require the same amount of wind up. So my big problem with Eyes of Tomorrow is kind of similar with my problem with Tessellation, right? In theory, they sound like they're good weapons, right? You get a bunch of kills on a bunch of ads, you're basically infinitely spamming these rockets that are very high power, and whenever you encounter like a champion or like a major or mini boss or whatever, you can just ADS on that target specifically, and you get a 50% boost from all the kills that you've been racking up through adaptive ordnance. The same thing for Tessellation, right? Tessellation sounds like it would be a good exotic with Prismatic, because you get a bunch of grenades back really quickly, or like Song of Flame. And then you actually try it, and the big problem is they just feel really clunky and have really slow animations. And so I didn't really account for that when I was thinking about this weapon in theory, and in practice it ended up being a relatively ineffective weapon compared to just using your standard fanfare when it comes to ad clear. So that's why I dropped Eyes of Tomorrow to the F tier. I think that is just an honest placement for it. Graviton Lance. Graviton Lance, I don't really think deserves to be in the same tier as Sunshot. Sunshot is in the A tier, not to spoil anything. But I don't think Graviton deserves to be in the A tier, mostly because it's a pulse rifle, right? It's a pulse rifle. Hand cannons generally tend to be more preferred compared to pulse rifles in solo challenge, low man type content. Now, that's not to say Graviton is horrible or anything. I just think that at a neutral level, it is, I don't know, it just doesn't have the same feel that Sunshot has to it. I know that is not really like an objective measure like I usually rely on, but Graviton Lance, certainly, like once you get it going, the explosions are very potent and they scale even decently into endgame content. But I think Sunshot is just such a consistent option. And of course it's solar too, so it does pair well with a lot of the subclasses that tend to be used in low mans and solos and stuff like that. So I don't know. Graviton Lance, I think I overrated it a little bit. I think Sunshot just, for whatever reason, maybe that it's that intangible that I mentioned just now, but for whatever reason, Sunshot just sees way more usage in low man and solo content. Like if you ask a low manner or a solo runner, like, hey, you know, what exotic primary would you use to farm ammo in between phases while you're waiting for the next phase of your, you know, crazy solo DPS check or whatever, they're gonna say Sunshot, right? They're gonna say Sunshot. So, you know, Sunshot is kind of just has that mystery factor, that solo factor that I think makes it, you know, quite a bit better than Graviton in those cases. Okay, next we have Riskrunner. I think I overrated Riskrunner's DR potential. First of all, Arc Conductor Ergo does the exact same thing as Riskrunner in terms of DR, 50% DR shield, except you can proc it whenever you want. You don't need Arc enemies in your vicinity to proc the Arc Conductor shield of Ergo, and Ergo has much better ad clear than Riskrunner. Much safer. Okay, no, they're about the same safety. But Riskrunner is just like, it's horrible at range, number one. It is an SMG, and unfortunately SMGs are in a really bad spot right now. Even if it's an exotic primary, it just really struggles unless you are consistently getting arc damage, and there are a bunch of red bars that are like low health near you, right? And in that case, you would probably do pretty well with Trinity as well, right? So Riskrunner is on hit, but it's so conditional that I had to drop it tiers, and Ergo kind of does the same job and has, you know, respectable enough ammo efficiency that you can kind of ignore the fact that it's a special. Okay, next up we have Dragon's Breath. Dragon's Breath, there are other strong exotic heavies that do similar, if not better, total damage than Dragon's Breath does. Dragon's Breath is also, I would say, I think I underrated or underestimated how niche the builds are that it's related to. So Dragon's Breath is really going to be good on maybe, you know, Solar Warlock, for example, where you could spam Solar Nades or Fusion Nades on Starfire or Apotheosis or something like that to really make use of this weapon's exotic traits, like Composite Propellant. However, on most of the meta damage subclasses these days, Dragon's Breath doesn't really make sense because they don't really produce a lot of ignitions. And even when they do produce ignitions, you'd probably rather be using another exotic over Dragon's Breath. So yeah, I think Dragon's Breath this season has taken a bit of a hit, and I think I overestimated last season how good it is, even as a solo damage exotic, which I still think it's a good exotic, but you know, I think I did overrate it a bit. Okay, Conditional Finality. Again, I think I overrated this thing's unstoppable capability plus its damage. I really wanted to make Conditional work in a damage rotation. Unfortunately, I don't think I really was able to. Conditional is, I don't know, it is still an aggressive shotgun and it does do pretty respectable damage, but is it worth your exotic slot? I wouldn't necessarily say so. And I would say for unstop capability, again, similar to how I said that Radiant is so available, there are stronger barrier options than Arbalest and Wishender. The same thing really applies to Conditional, and Conditional is a riskier pick than Arbalest too, given that it's a shotgun and you need to hit most of its pellets to stun and unstop. Yeah, Conditional, I mean, it's a good pocket pick for sure for certain encounters, maybe like Verity and Salvation's Edge. I know it's popular there. But as like a neutral exotic or for use in like GMs, I've used this thing before. I liked it, but I really don't think it's like, you know, meta defining or anything like that. So I think it does deserve to drop a tier, especially now that we're tightening the tiers and making them really refined. Okay, Osteo Striga. I think this might be the biggest drop. The internal cooldown on poison kills really hit this exotic hard. Now obviously there is still not really a cooldown on if you hit a target a bunch of times. I think in the crit it like releases that poison splash, but even now, like even though that's an on hit effect, that poison internal cooldown on kills was such a big part of Osteo's identity, and it's just been gutted. Obviously, there are other strong kinetic splash weapons like I mentioned, like Necro or Khvostov, that have been introduced that are contenders and competitors to even old Osteo, but this thing got nerfed so hard there's just no reason to use this thing ever again, I think, in endgame content until it gets buffed or something like that. Okay, down to our last, I don't know, 12 or so. Legend of Acrius. Legend of Acrius is a pretty strong DPS option for melee range. This was really just me looking at the sustain tab again and looking at Legend of Acrius. Granted, that row is very precise and uses like almost frame perfect rain of fire timings, but even if you're not optimal with this thing, it's pretty easy to use with stuff like Song of Flame, for example. So I think Legend of Acrius is pretty nice, a strong DPS option for melee range, and I think I underrated it a little bit last season, especially when we're considering the other DPS options that are in the C tier, like Dragon's Breath. Okay, Outbreak Perfected, I'm moving it up one tier. It got buffed by pulses, it became craftable since I last made this exotic tier list. It's also great for building Transcendence, and it's decent for chipping away at a major. It's good for day 1 DPS, so it does a lot of things. Now these things are maybe arguably not super useful for an optimal player. They're useful in some cases, in some niche cases, but it does do a lot of things, right? It does do a lot of things, and it does them pretty well. So I decided to give it a C tier. It's kind of unfair to like put it in the D tier. Does it belong in the C or B tier where other strong weapons are? We're going to look at the actual tier list when all of this is said and done, and I'll kind of discuss why I put it where I think I put it, because I think a lot of people are in love with Outbreak right now, given its anti-barrier Outbreak, and people are using it in GMs and stuff right now, but I do think it belongs in the C tier, and we'll talk about why when we actually look at the tier list once all of the damage has been done. Okay, Gjallarhorn. Gjallarhorn, surprisingly, or maybe not surprisingly, has been moved out of S tier, and that's because rockets, I think, are kind of gradually moving out of the DPS meta. Even when they are used in stuff like solo challenges or even like low-man challenges, they tend to be used even without Galley. So, rockets, they're less relevant in the GM meta right now as well, because the GM meta is dominated by abilities. In fact, fun fact, once we get to the exotic weapon tier list, which I'll show you once I go over the changelog, there's actually no green check marks for exotic weapons in the GM column. And that's because the GM meta right now is so heavily dominated by prismatic and ability spam that there isn't really an exotic weapon that you can point to and say, yeah, this is the carry, this is the strong suit in GMs. And because it's just not true. There's just no exotic weapons that are incredibly strong in GMs right now that they really outshine what's going on in the meta right now, which is just ability spamming, right? So all the exotic weapons you take are kind of just in service of that goal, right? For example, when you take Outbreak in a GM, it's to build Transcendence, so you can spam abilities more, right? So it's like, they're not really the driving factor, the driving force, like Gjallarhorn used to be when people used to spam bipod rockets and galley, maybe last season or 2 seasons ago. Okay, Cloudstrike. Cloudstrike got a small sniper buff, and I would say this is a good meta for it. Now, I don't account for artifact mods like Sniper's Meditation when I talk about exotic weapons or when I make these tier lists, but when I say good meta for it, I'm not even referring to the artifact. I'm saying the current damage meta that we have. I think Cloudstrike is well suited for it. It's well suited for it. It's probably, the best it's ever been, I would say, right? And of course, it did receive a small damage buff as well. It's just good in some rotations right now, and an excellent total damage option. One of the best energy, special options outside of Still Hunt. And so if you're not a Titan or a Warlock, I think Cloudstrike is a pretty good shout for damage. And so I did put it in the B tier. Okay, moving on, we have Khvostov. Originally, I had Khvostov in a pretty low tier, and then I went out and I looked at a bunch of people like doing GMs and master raids and stuff with this weapon, and I wasn't necessarily like super impressed, so you're not going to see me put it in the B tier or in the A tier or anything like that, but I think it is one of the best kinetic primaries, kinetic exotic primaries, and it's an on-hit weapon, which is really of high importance in endgame content, in the GM column, in the solo column, stuff like that, where you are really maybe facing enemies that are tankier. Khvostov will serve you well there, and if you build around getting orbs, it does shred ads pretty quickly. So Khvostov, I would say it's a strong on-hit splash damage option, which is why it's in the C tier with his friend Outbreak. Okay, Still Hunt. Still Hunt is the only new S tier this season. It's the strongest DPS exotic of the last 2 years. Even with the 33% nerf that it received, it is still very strong burst. It's still good to use on Hunter, and so I've put it in the S tier. It's pretty strong. Maybe I'll move it down next season, depending on how I feel, depending on how rotations pan out. Maybe it's not as good as I think it is, but for now, I'm going to leave it in the S tier because it is incredibly dominant on Hunter as a DPS option. You can even use it in GMs with, like, instead of Div Izzy, you do Div Still Hunt. That is certainly an option. But for now, I'm going to leave it in the S tier. I think that is where it belongs, even just on its damage merits and not on its roaming potential. Next, we have Merciless. Merciless was in the A tier before. Given the current damage meta in solos and low-mans, I think Merciless has seen a decrease in usage rate, number one. Number two, I also think I overrated it last season. It's just not used as much in solos and low-mans as I originally thought. In speedrunning, it has basically no presence. In day one, you could use it theoretically, but it exists in the same slot as Still Hunt, right? Even on other classes, maybe there's other exotic weapons that you might prefer using over Merciless. There might not be kills available for Impetus. So yeah, Merciless, I think I did overrate it, but I do think it deserves to be not like in the F tier or anything like that. I think it does deserve to be in the C tier with a lot of the other decent damage options like Dragon's Breath that have the right time and place for them. Hierarchy of Needs. Hierarchy of Needs, this weapon is very potent once you get the ring set up. But the problem that I have, that I kind of discussed in my stream chat the other day, is that Hierarchy of Needs really focuses on a static gameplay style where you hunker down, you create this, this ring, and then you just absolutely go ham on a room. Now, Destiny 2 is a game that tends to focus on and favor mobile playstyles, moving from room to room, killing an ad, killing champs, and then moving on to the next room, and then doing the same thing. Or even in raid encounters, you kill ads in one area, you move to the next area, start doing damage, you move to this area, move to the next room, right? So I kind of underestimated how much that setup time is for what I will call a disproportionate payoff. So what do I mean by that? Well, let me think about a weapon like Sunshot or Graviton. Sunshot or Graviton, you kill an ad, it explodes. The explosion, that's like the maximum. You've already reached the maximum potential of the weapon, right? You just need to get a kill, kaboom. That is the payoff, right? You can pull out the weapon, get one kill, and stow it, and then move on. Maybe do damage with your heavy weapon, do damage with your special weapon, move on, go to another room. Hierarchy of Needs is you have to get 6 crits, or 3 crit kills, or 6 kills. And then once you do that, you hipfire, you make your ring, and then you start hipfiring Seekers through that ring. So you see how there's an incredible amount of setup for what I will call a disproportionate payoff. And what I mean by that is the payoff that you're getting by getting this ring and being able to hipfire these Seekers rapidly. Is it greater on average than what you would be able to accomplish with Sunshot or Graviton in the same amount of time? And I would say on average, certainly not, right? If you take the same amount of time with Hierarchy to just get all these kills with a bow that doesn't have any splash perk until you get those kills. You get all these kills with your bow, and then you set up the ring, and then you start shooting. Instead of just shooting right away with Graviton and immediately getting those explosions, yeah, I don't know. There's not that many places in D2 where I think the setup time is really worth it, right? You could argue maybe in stuff like, I don't know, the Devil's Lair GM, that one room where you're kind of like doing base defense for a really long time. In places like that, it could be possibly useful. But again, the sandbox has kind of shifted around this thing. Well nerfs have hit this thing, for example. You can use it with stuff like Song of Flame. But again, it's just, wrong time, wrong place, I think, for it. But I think E tier is fair. It's certainly not an F tier exotic, right? You can't really ignore the potency of that ring and the Seekers. I will say also that its use for boss DPS is not really super relevant either. Outbreak and Final Warning both outshine this thing for DPS. So yeah, it's not really super useful for that either. Buried Bloodline. Now, on the opposite spectrum of Hierarchy of Needs, I think I underrated Buried Bloodline last patch for survivability. However, I'm not going to move it into like the B or the A tier because Aberrant Action exists and Rocket Saturn just got a nerf. And so unfortunately, Buried Bloodline does not act like a primary anymore for finder generation purposes. So it's really going to struggle when you compare it against something like a Sunshot or a Graviton in the energy slot. And of course, it is competing with stuff like Aberrant Action for survivability. So it does give you Devour, and that weaken effect is kind of nice. But at the end of the day, I don't think Buried Bloodline is a top of the meta exotic. It's certainly a nice pocket pick to bring out. And I know a lot of people do favor using this exotic in their builds, and it's a good way to clinch up and get some survivability in a build that otherwise lacks that. But besides that, I think its spot in the meta is not super well defined for optimal play. Next up, we have Final Warning. Final Warning, I think I underrated its major burst potential as just a neutral roam exotic. Now, I will say the biggest problem with Final Warning is that it really lacks splash damage as an exotic kinetic primary. Think about something like a Necro or even an Outbreak or even a Khvostov, right? Khvostov, all these weapons have great splash damage on top of having decent major damage. Final Warning is like really forgoes splash damage. Even the Unravel burst just doesn't do that much damage in endgame content, whereas it really hones in on that major burst potential. But that major burst potential comes at a cost, right? You need to be pretty close to that enemy. But I will say the boss DPS of this thing kind of surprised me, given how easy it is to use, how stackable it is. It doesn't require you to get to a bunch of nanites like Outbreak does and does similar damage. So yeah, I will say Final Warning, I think I underrated its major burst potential as a kind of roam exotic, but it's certainly not deserving of being in the C or the B tier with like Outbreak and Khvostov because it just doesn't have the same amount of oomph to it when it comes to primary red bar shred. Okay, our last two, Polaris Lance, very underwhelming with the lack of artifact support. Last season, it was very difficult to kind of analyze Polaris outside of the context of the artifact last season, and now that it's gone this season, I can safely say this weapon is extremely underwhelming. Its archetype is absolutely terrible for endgame PvE, even being an exotic primary, and its payoff is pretty awful for how long it takes to get that payoff. Yeah, this is kind of just another exotic weapon that's been outshined by the Ergo role that carries its name. There's a perfect fifth Ergo Sum that is much more viable in endgame content than this thing is. So yeah, I'm gonna have to slap this thing with the F tier. All right, finally we have Malfeasance. Malfeasance has been outshined a little bit by Warden's Law. Warden's Law is generally better than Malfeasance without taking up your exotic slot. If you have someone on Witherhoard, or if you're doing like a GM speedrun with like taken enemies, I can see Malfeasance seeing a resurgence, which is why I didn't move it to like D tier or E tier or anything. But I would say for damage purposes, Warden's Law is generally better. A lot of the time people are using Lucky Pants in like solo focused damage rotations, and so as a result, Malfeasance is not really going to feature in those compared to Warden's Law. And you can also use like an exotic like Still Hunt, for example, with Warden's Law. So yeah, it doesn't really make sense to put Malfeasance any higher than this. I think this is a solid place for it. And as for all the other exotics, like we talked about, I just increased tier strictness and I moved them down. Okay, so with that out of the way, let's actually go to the exotic weapon tier list. And I'll stop teasing you, and we'll go all the way to the top and talk about what these tiers look like in 2024. So in the top tier, we have Still Hunt and Tractor Cannon. Still Hunt and Tractor Cannon, you know, they have 4 check marks each. You know, really not super relevant in GMs and less relevant in solo content because Tractor Cannon requires you to kind of be on a melee build and forego an exotic heavy that is focused on damage specifically. And Still Hunt is limited to, I don't know, some bosses, I suppose. You wouldn't use Still Hunt on every boss. So yeah, that's kind of where Still Hunt and Tractor are sitting. A tier, Ergo, Galley, Sunshot, Navigator. These are kind of like all used for different things, but I think they all deserve to be in the A tier. Ergo, originally I had it in a lower tier, but I kind of decided to move it up. I think it is so versatile, and it is best in slot for a lot of useful things, and so I decided to put it in the A tier. We have our B tier, which is Cloudstrike, Izzy, 2 decent exotic damage snipers. We have Legend of Acrius, which I underrated. You have Lumina, Parasite, which I believe have moved down this season a little bit. We have 4th Horseman, which is like bottom of B tier, and then we have Trinity Ghoul, which is still pretty solid exotic for ad clear, unconditional ad clear with red bars. There's nothing that has the potency of Trinity Ghoul and something like a like a day 1 Rulk, for example. C tier, Bastion, I think Bastion is kind of like conditional, except for I think its damage properties are more useful than conditional. So I put in the C tier. Buried Bloodline, Div for day 1s, you know, Dragon's Breath. And you can kind of see, by the way, how these ratings for usage rates are informing my tier placement decision, right? You see S tier, 4 check marks, A tier, a couple check marks or a bunch of triangles. You know, B tier, couple triangles. You have a C tier, maybe 1 or 2 triangles, maybe 1 check mark. Like I said before, we were going to talk about Microcosm. Microcosm has a check mark for day 1 because I really think it is that good of a consistent damage option. It really falters for optimal DPS outside of a day 1, and then in other stuff, it's not really useful at all, right? So boom, C tier there, C tier. We have the D tier, which is almost no check marks whatsoever. We have E tier. There is a triangle here, but it's because it's speedrunning, right? It's speedrunning only. I'm not going to really give it much credit because it's only used in speedrunning. You know, same thing with Salvation's Grip, for example. It's used in speedrunning a lot, but in nothing else pretty much. And then F tier. F tier is all X's, right? So that's pretty much it. I hope you guys enjoyed this. We did spend a fair amount of time honing this tier list, so I hope it ended up pretty well. I hope you guys enjoyed watching this. But after this, we are going to do the origin trait and perk tier list separately. The perk tier list, I probably won't explain every decision that I've made because it is insanely long. I think I made like 150 changes to placements in that tier list. And I also introduced a G and an H tier, which might be a tier list first for this channel because there's just so many perks in this game. And then origin traits, I'll just probably talk about the new ones that I added. So yeah, that's pretty much it. I hope you guys enjoyed. If you guys have any disagreements, feel free to leave them in the comments. If you liked it, you know, feel free to leave it in the comments. But I think this tier list, this exotic weapon tier list, is the most solid and most accurate version of this tier list that I've ever made. I'm pretty happy with this tier list compared to even some of the other ones in this spreadsheet, and I think it is pretty solid. And hopefully we'll give it a little update that is maybe less significant next season because it's so accurate. All right, goodbye for now, and I will see you in the next one.